What Amy said is true. The start of my work was because of I Am We Are and something that they did. My name is Julia, and I am a volunteer and event specialist at Breaking Free. And Breaking Free's mission is to educate and provide services for women and girls who have been victims of sex trafficking or sexual exploitation and need assistance escaping the violence in their lives. We are one of the only organizations in Minnesota, I think we're one of two, that provides direct services for women and girls coming out of exploitation. We are the only one that starts and finishes with them. So we reach out to them, we do outreach on the streets, we bring them in, we provide them with housing, we have a food shelf, we have clothing, we have a 14-week program called the Sisters of Survival program, which is really at the center of Breaking Free. And after that, the women graduate and they're welcomed into our alumni program. We have a program that brings them even from being alumni into internships at Breaking Free, paid internships. And we stick with them and we're available as resources for them from beginning to end. So it's a really exciting organization. I love Breaking Free, and I love the people that I work with. I've been with them now for about 6 months, and I'll get into a little bit more about that later. So we can actually rewind back to my sophomore year at Gustavus. In 2011, in the spring, the theme of the Building Bridges Conference was Not for Sale, Slavery Past and Present. And I don't think that any of you here would be old enough to have been there, but it was a really incredible experience. Dr. Joy DeGruy came and she talked about post-traumatic slave syndrome. And that was a really fascinating talk. And the kind of fun fact about this that I haven't even told anybody at Breaking Free is that Joy Friedman, who was the director of women's programs and is now the director of outreach and programs at Breaking Free, she spoke that day, but I missed it, and I don't know why. I think I was hungry and tired, and so I got lunch and just stayed and didn't actually see Joy speak, which is funny to me now, because her office is down the stairs from mine. It used to be down the hall from mine, and I've since seen her speak, and she's wonderful. But so at this conference, the thing that was really transformative for me was the I Am We Are action piece. And I thought about sending you the video that they started with and finding it and sending it to you. I can maybe show you later or something. But so we started by going up into this small room, and they had a video playing of it was like some facts about sex trafficking, and then these guys who were at a bachelor party, and they were in the car, and they're like, oh man, this is gonna be awesome, and they're going to a hotel, and they're going up the stairs of the hotel, and they open the door, and the whole party deflates, and there's a little girl sitting on the bed, and she can't be any more than 10 years old. She's probably 7 or 8. And the guys in the party are like, what kind of party is this, man? And then they kind of launch into what sex trafficking is. And that was the base. And that set the stage for the rest of the experience, which was astounding. We walked, I remember it vividly, because it was so visceral and such a significant part of my journey, I guess. So we walked down the stairs, and Dan Burnett was standing there. It was an alum who he was supposed to be dressed like a pimp, and he just had his eyes on us and watched us, and it looked like he was picking us apart as we walked down the stairs. And at this time they had transformed Old Main into a red light district, basically into a brothel. Into a red light district, I guess, as the main hallway downstairs. And the first room that we went into is very dark, and there were people sitting at the front, and they put us up on pedestals with numbers on them, and they started picking us apart and saying, she's too short, or she's too fat, or he's too small, or whatever. And then they grabbed an actress off of the pedestal and pulled her away like she was being bought. And then the room that I will never forget. We walked into this space. I don't know which room it was, but there were these beds lining the walls, and there were these sheets hanging down. And now, knowing what I know about Old Main, I'm sure it was a bigger space than I remember it being, but I remember it being tiny, like the size of the space inside of these tables. And I remember trying to squeeze to the inside of the circle, because I wasn't in I Am We Are at the time, but I knew a lot of the people who were. And I remember it was so visceral and upsetting to me that I didn't want to look them in the eye, because I was afraid that if I did, I wasn't going to be able to interact with them the same way after this. Because, and to give you a little bit more context, the room was very dark, and there might have been music playing, I don't remember, but there were beds that, and behind the sheets, you would hear this steady thumping rhythm, and you knew that it was a woman being raped. And because of the video, you thought it was like probably a child being raped, that was what they were trying to happen. And I think it was Ethan Bieland who was walking around the circle, and he picked one of the girls in the circle, who is obviously an actress, and pulled her into behind one of the sheets, and then you could hear again the methodical thumping of the springs on the mattress and their hands against the walls, whatever they were doing to make it feel as real as they could. And I remember walking up to that space where they did the debriefing for the counseling, and I burst into tears, and I couldn't deal with it. And I remember the counselor asked me if I was gonna be okay. And I said, I'm gonna be okay, but this is not okay. And I really don't know what to do about it. And that night, or that afternoon, I guess, I went home, and I was still crying, it was body emotion overload with information. And I remember going inside, and I lived with Prepare Ministries at the time in an ILS house, and you'll find really quickly that my faith is a really important component of my journey. And I remember talking to a woman in my house who was my big sister in many ways, and saying to her, I don't know how to keep doing this. I don't know how to live at Gustavus and keep being in this environment, knowing what I do now about what's happening. I don't know how I can stay. And I remember Laura giving me a big hug, and then saying, God has you here for a reason, and you're at Gustavus because you're supposed to be. And that was all she really needed to say for me. Obviously, I didn't drop out. But I think if I'd gotten a call that day and someone was like, Julia, we need you on the forefront of the battle against sex trafficking, I would have been like, I'm there. Bye, Gustavus. So after that point, the issue really kind of fell out of my head a little bit. Not that I wasn't, well, I'll put it this way. So I tend to think about the way that we interact with social justice issues as being divided into kind of an awareness and then a consciousness place. And I feel that awareness is really the level at which if somebody wants to have a conversation with you, you can talk about the issue. If somebody puts up a poster, you'll understand what the words mean, and you'll kind of get it, and you might find it interesting. But there's a whole process that needs to happen between being aware and being conscious. And I believe that consciousness is the point at which you see the world through the lenses of that issue. And I was not at that point yet with sex trafficking. It was another one of the issues that I cared about, but not actively enough and not in a conscious enough way to really act on how I felt about it. So then 2 years at Gustavus happened. And it was shortly after that I Am We Are performance that I joined I Am We Are. And it was largely because I went to a workshop on interfaith communities, and I participated and I really enjoyed it. And I ended up going to workshops on that with the workshop group at the time, and getting involved and just loving what I was doing and loving the acting and the writing and the people that I was with. And I thought it was really interesting what we were trying to accomplish, and just kind of dove right in. And I think about that time as being those 2 years as the time when 3 really important things happened to me that set the stage for this to happen with Breaking Free. And so those and I've thought a lot about this in the past week or so. But 3 things needed to happen, and those things really happened through and with I Am We Are. The first thing was that I just generally needed to come to terms with a lot of things about myself that I was kind of avoiding, that I Am We Are helped me to name, and that workshops helped me to name and to talk about in a productive way. It was like not being therapy, but being therapeutic, which is something we talk about a lot, I think, when we talk about social justice. It was very therapeutic for me to start talking about introversion, because I'm an introvert, and to talk about anxiety, which is something that my community really helped me to understand. I live with panic disorder, so it's not general anxiety. Panic disorder is more where you have panic attacks, and then you like panic about getting panic attacks, and maybe like have panic attacks about getting panic attacks. And I also have social anxiety, and a lot of people are like, no, you don't, and you're not an introvert. And to those people, I say, well, like that just a lot of people have that perception that if you like to perform, or if you're good in front of audiences, that you must be an extrovert and you must be okay. But like, we know that that's not the way that it is. You know, we know that there are a lot of components of our lives that are invisible, or that we put away, and just because like we might be a good public speaker doesn't mean like we're, you know, doesn't mean that it gives us energy. It probably takes energy away from us, you know. So I needed to learn like that stuff about myself, and I needed to learn some things about my personal life, and how to name those things. And I grew up in an environment that was very. I was told a lot when I was growing up that I wasn't supposed to like feel the things that I felt. So like if I was sad, like I wasn't supposed to be sad, because there was like a reason for what was happening, and because of that reason, I was not allowed to be sad or angry or scared. Like there were things that were more important than that. And so I Am We Are really helped me to let those emotions happen, and gave me an environment where we could like check in and do stuff, and those emotions could come out, and then we could check out, and the feelings that we had were validated and appreciated and shared and responded to in a really positive environment. And I think that is one really beautiful thing about I Am We Are, and another way in which it's not therapy. Like I wasn't going there to like learn how to be angry and okay with being angry, but it was a therapeutic component of it, which was wonderful. So that's one thing. I had to learn kind of who I was and how to accept those things about myself. I think the second thing that I really needed to come to terms with was my feminism. I learned a lot about sex and gender and sexuality in my time at Gustavus. I studied queer theory for a long time, and I love it. I love it so much. It's so interesting. And it was one of those funny things where like for a while I was like, I learned queer theory, and now I feel like maybe I don't have to be a feminist. Now I feel like maybe I can just be a humanist. And I don't want to make anybody feel bad who is in that boat. But I think feminism is really important. And I took a class by Lisa Heldke called Gender Knowledge and Reality. That was like the best class that I took outside of theater and English. It was phenomenal. And no, it was outside of these departments, because I took a lot of really important courses in theater and English that were transformative for me. But like that one, we had a weekly assignment that we had to turn in to Lisa. And at the end of all of my assignments, I made up this section called "Am I a feminist yet?" And then I would actually like update her on my progress. I'd be like, you know, this week I've been thinking a lot about queer theory, and I'm kind of like, well, why do I have to be a feminist? Like, why couldn't I just be this other thing? And it was over the course of that class that I learned a lot about intersectionality, and about the importance of herstory, and the importance of a lot of things. And I'm not here to tell you to be a feminist, but I love being a feminist, and I think you should too. So that was the second really big and important thing. And then the third thing was I needed to step into leadership, and step into my voice, and step into myself, and understand that who I was valuable, and that I had valuable and important things to say. And that I needed to say those things, you know, and that really happened in I Am We Are for me, in spaces where I could write and have that be a part of a community that I was in places where I could perform in places where I could dissect and then create ideas about things that were important and be made to feel like that was important and that I was a leader. And so another kind of little side piece in this, and I've been trying to kind of own this because, again, sometimes I can be bad at owning things about myself that I'm proud of, because I'm a woman and a person and I'm not supposed to be proud of things, kind of thing, you know, and that's complicated. But so my senior year, I went abroad to the University of Oxford, and it was an incredible experience, and that helped me to become independent in a lot of ways, but it also gave me the confidence then after that to apply for the Rhodes Scholarship, and I got an interview for the Rhodes Scholarship when I left Gustavus. So I was in the middle of like a gap year, and I had all of these lessons about who I was from my experiences at Gustavus and at IMWR. And I was feeling really good and really confident, and I wanted to study disability studies abroad at Oxford again. And then I picked up the book Half the Sky by Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wu Dunn. And that was the moment that I went from awareness to consciousness. It was like it had been lying in the back of my brain for the whole time. And everything that I was learning, I firmly believe was bringing me to this point. But when I read that book, everything changed about the way that I was seeing the world. I actually read it at the time that I was doing mock interviews, and I remember going into one of those interviews, and they asked me, they said, you have $10,000 and $1 million. Pick two things that you're going to give the money to, and then explain why you would give the money to them. And I was like, I would give disability studies like $10,000 because I think it's important and they could use an awareness campaign. Then I was like, but I would give human trafficking $1 million and I would do all of these things with it, and people are enslaved. And I started like naming all of these facts and figures that I got from the book, and like practically quoting the book. I was just, and I remember getting to the comment part of it, and they were like, hey, so your answers were really great, and we love how much you knew about that. But it's really important for you to talk about the thing that you applied to do in your interview. So like maybe switch your trajectory a little bit with your focus. And I didn't get the Rhodes Scholarship, and I'm thankful. I am really thankful for that, because if I had gone that route and I had continued in English, I think I would have felt like trapped in a lot of ways. Because like I said, this thing was like unleashed in me when I read Half the Sky. And to give you a little bit more context for that book, and to give it a full recommendation, because you have to read it because it's the best book in the world. It's about the human rights violations facing women around the world. And the top three that they name are maternal mortality, because it is ridiculous that so many women around the world die in childbirth, because we know how to do it in safe and sanitary situations, and so it's ridiculous that it's happening this way. Female genital mutilation, and some people will refer to it as female genital cutting. I will refer to it as female genital mutilation, because come on! And then the third kind of human rights violation was sex trafficking. And they went into a lot of detail and talked about, the thing that's great about the book is that they use personal stories, but they also use statistics in a good way, so they work with each other to inform you. And from that book forward, I was off. I spent a good 6 months unemployed, just reading books. I read books like Trafficked by Sophie Hayes, which was the first personal account that I had heard. And so Half the Sky talked a lot about international stuff, but Trafficked is by a white woman who's 24 from Leeds in the UK. Privilege, she's living in a good area, and the way that it happened to her was that she had a friendship with a guy for 4 years from Italy. And one day he called her and was like, hey, why don't you come and visit me? And she went, and within 24 hours she was on the streets selling her body for this guy. And I read that, and I read just as many articles as I could and as much information, and I started to learn more about the issue in Minnesota. And that's when I refound breaking free. So a lot of stuff also happened that was just like life stuff. When you graduate, you do a lot of stuff. Like you try to figure stuff out. And so I was a flight attendant for like 3 of the worst months ever. I looked really good in my little red thing. And I did that. I was a bookseller for a long time, like 9 months. That's a long time when you're a graduate. That's gonna be a long time. And so the way that I transitioned into my position at Breaking Free was that I started volunteering, and I have to tell you right now, and if you take nothing else away, that please don't actually rewind. If you're interested in working in the nonprofit world, this is one of the most important things that you can get out of this conversation, is that the #1 best way to break into the nonprofit field is to volunteer. Because that's how you get in with people, and they remember your face and they remember who you are, and they start to form connections with you and the work that you're doing. And that's where you can use all of the lessons that you've learned at Gustavus about producing stuff, sometimes really fast, but at a high quality that will impress people. And in the nonprofit world, and I think sometimes in the job world, people are just really impressed that somebody tried. And so that's what I did when I went into this thing. I joined a capital campaign, which I knew nothing about, and I just tried. And a couple of months after I had just been offered a management position at Barnes & Noble, when I got a call from Breaking Free, and they said, hey, so we have a job. Do you want it? Call me. And I was like, yes. And I turned down the management position and went to Breaking Free. And it was weird because I was working part-time at Barnes & Noble for a while and part-time at Breaking Free, but I knew, I can't emphasize for you enough. Nothing has ever touched my life the way that these issues have touched my life. Nothing has ever had such an incredible imprint on the person that I am, or transformed the way I see the world now. Nothing. I've never experienced it before. And so for me, going with Breaking Free was really natural. And I something like 3 months later, I was promoted from a part-time temporary position into a full-time permanent position. I'm now the volunteer and event specialist at Breaking Free. My job is largely to connect people and the things that they're passionate about to the things that we need at Breaking Free, which gets really complicated for a lot of reasons, because we have a lot of people that are really interested in helping us and working with us, and not a lot of volunteer opportunities because we're providing direct services for something that is really, really, really complicated. And some people will think, if I know something about sexual violence, or if I know something about homelessness, or if I know something about labor exploitation, then I must understand what is happening here. And it is just so complicated and so big that we really need very specific training for people to approach victims and survivors and alumni and people who've been in the life with compassion and with trauma-informed care. So that's what I do on the volunteer side. And on the event side, I plan events. We have one coming up called the Demand Change Project that Sam is going to be helping with, and a couple of others from mine we are. And you can and should take those flyers and think about going, because it's going to be amazing. But the last thing that I'll say to kind of wrap up the holistic story is, well, I guess, yeah, the last thing I'll say is that I learned what I learned in the field from working with survivors. And that is one of the most important things I think about Breaking Free that makes it work so well, is that it is a survivor-led organization from the bottom to the top. We have a lot of survivors working in that community. Receptionist, the founder and executive director, volunteer coordinator, Joy, who is who's the outreach director. All of these people have had the grace and the courage to speak out about their stories. And so one of the things that I try to emphasize is that it's their story, and it's their movement, and Like, they need to do it, and if there's any way that I can help, I'll help. But it's because of them that I am kind of where I am in terms of breaking free. But when it comes to Gustavus and the experiences that I had at Gustavus, working with social justice theater and working with Amy and working with a community of people who were open to working on social justice, who were open to the idea and the truth of oppression and to the complexities of situations in which violence is happening against people, set the stage to be, for everything. It made me into a person who could receive the issue of sex trafficking and not only understand it in a little bit more detail than I might have been able to before, but also feel like I could respond to it with a voice that is powerful and respectful and important and needed. And so that is kind of the story.
Overview.
The overview. Yeah.
Well, we could go to questions about that, about breaking free and so forth, and then, maybe we'll go back and forth in terms of history. I mean, some of our guests we've said, what was it like 20 years ago, but that's a little different for someone more recent. So do people have questions for Julia at this point? I just want to have her.
Yeah.
One of our very first guest speakers, Coco, came and she spoke to us about like nonprofit organizations and
Yeah.
how it's sometimes hard to really, I guess, implement your ideas and the things that you want to do within it.
Yeah.
So, and then you were speaking about nonprofit organizations too and how important it is to be a part of it. So do you ever feel like it's hard to do that, I guess, to really put your ideas within an organization and program like that?
Well, every organization is really different, and I think that one big difference between Coco's organization and mine is that hers is, I feel, my perception is that it's really well established in kind of a different way from Breaking Free. Breaking Free has been around since 1996 in various forms, but up until like 5 years ago, there were maybe 4 employees there. Things have changed a lot in the past couple of years, in large part because the world is becoming more aware of the issue of sex trafficking. And so we've had a lot of rapid expansion, and there's a lot of places that we still have to go within that area, and a lot of places that we have room to improve and we have room for those ideas. And so that has not been my experience with nonprofits. To give you an example, I've been really worried about talking to our volunteer coordinator. Not that she's a worrisome person to talk to. She's amazing. She's a beautiful human being who is so open to ideas and loves to talk about issues and things like that. But I really feel that there are gaps in our volunteer area in terms of how much time it takes us to process one volunteer and get them into the organization, but also volunteers falling through the cracks, and it's a big issue that we have. And I was kind of worried that if I brought these ideas to her, that she'd be like, well, this is how we do it, so I think we're gonna stick with it. But I talked to her, yesterday I had the opportunity to go into her office and say, I have some ideas, and these are what they are. And she just got excited, I just have a lot of room because there are fewer employees, the environment is a little bit less structured, and I think also probably because I'm working with, well, not even that, because I've also had the opportunity lately to be a little bit more involved in developing programs too. So, I mean, and that is something that I never would have dreamed that I'd be doing at 23. I mean, I planned that conference in 5 months. Like, it's happening next month, A lot of it has come out of my mind, a lot of like sponsorship packet stuff and reaching out to people, and it's not perfect because it's the first time that I'm doing it, but it's something where I've had a lot of freedom there, or planning to talk to the women's program more about the issue of finances, and I'm trying to integrate some good programs into there that we might not have had so well established before, and the volunteer program that I told you about. So that, like I said, would not be my experience, but I wouldn't necessarily be surprised to hear that that is the experience in other organizations like COCO's.
Mm.
So how long does a woman spend in the program from reaching out to them on the street to graduation?
Yeah, so I can also talk a little bit more about human trafficking and the issue. And if you have any questions about that, you should ask me, because it is a really important thing, and I know a lot about it that I would love to share with you.
It's
So
also kind of shocking, I mean, shouldn't be shocked, I suppose, but to think of it as something that happens in Minnesota, right?
so seriously happens in Minnesota. I
And
cannot
you
tell
think
you
of it
enough.
as a third world
Yeah.
thing, or as a big city thing.
I'm
or
not
as
kidding when I
a-
say it happens in St. Peter. That's not an exaggeration. I firmly believe that it's happening in St. Peter. I know that it's happening in Mankato for a fact. Like, there's no question in my mind. I know that just a couple years ago there was a restaurant busted, or maybe it was last year, I don't remember, a restaurant busted for human trafficking, for labor trafficking. But I can say without a shadow of a doubt that there is sex trafficking and human trafficking happening in St. Peter and happening in Mankato. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I know, it's happening all over the place in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And we've got some really great partnerships that are emerging with the police departments, especially in St. Paul. But Minneapolis has a long way to go. A long way to go. We serve over 500 women and girls every year, because that is kind of that's what our resources are at Breaking Free, and that's kind of who we get. But I guess to kind of go back to Thomas's question a little bit, so the process starts with outreach, and we have a team of people who are trained to do the outreach work, which is complicated and frankly can be dangerous. I know that we had some people come in for kind of like an alternative spring break experience kind of thing, and they did outreach, and they're in teams, and we're with them the whole time. But even still, two of the ladies that were present with us, who were doing that outreach with us, were approached by traffickers. It's a reality. It's a reality. So once we get them into the program, they do kind of an intake process where we get a lot of information about them, because one thing I will say about the nonprofit world is that it's a numbers game. As hard as that is to kind of realize when you get into it, it's 100% a numbers game. If you have 500 ladies and your grant providers are asking you for the number of ladies who were victims of sexual violence as children, which is an enormous number. The vast majority of the girls that we see were victims of sexual abuse as children, and in fact, we see when it even comes to sexual exploitation, the average age of girls who enter into prostitution as minors, which is, so this is not the average age of everybody, but the average age of girls who enter into prostitution as minors is between 12 and 14 years old. That's a reality. But so once we get them into our program, they are set into our Sisters of Survival program, which is 14 weeks long, and they go through like the basics. I mean, really the basics of being alive and like living in normal society. It's an opportunity for them to get deprogrammed from the environment that they've been living in. To put that into some perspective, we literally will refer to the kind of world that they're living in as the stable, when we talk about the trafficker and then the woman in the middle who is the bottom bitch, and the women underneath her as the stable. And we will actually refer to the process of bringing them into the stable as breaking a woman. And it goes from recruitment into initiation into enslavement. So recruitment tends to be, it can happen in a lot of different ways. It's happening a lot more on social media now than it has ever happened before. Okay, so there was a video that came out not long ago, and a former trafficker talked about how he would recruit women or girls, and what he would do is go into a mall, and he would find a girl who was alone, and he would walk up to her, and he would say, "You have really beautiful eyes." And if the girl looked him in the face and said, "Thank you," He knew that he didn't have her. He knew that she had probably had a thorough support system, that she was okay, that she was comfortable with herself, and he would walk away. But if that girl or if that woman gave him any indications that she was not comfortable, if she looked at the ground, if she said, no, I don't, if she kind of mumbled, like, okay, thank you, then he would know that he had her. And he would begin the recruitment process, which is really getting closer to the person, to the woman or girl. And I say women and girl, please excuse me. The reason that I use that terminology is because those are the clients that we serve at Breaking Free, and the majority of the population of people who are in sex trafficking are women or girls. However, the sex trafficking of boys and the sex trafficking of transgender people and LGBTQ people is a huge problem. And I apologize that that's the terminology that I use, because I think it's important to include those populations when we talk about it. But it's just because of who we serve at Breaking Free, I'm going to stick with that language, and because it is kind of the more victims are in that circumstance. So in that system of recruitment, he will, sometimes not even the trafficker, sometimes it'll be a guy working through the trafficker. Sometimes it'll be a completely different person who calls himself the same person, and he's amiable, and so he'll call, and they'll have an hour-long conversation, and they will wait for a woman or a girl as long as it takes. Like I said, the guy in Leeds took 4 years of talking to her on the phone. She thought he was her best friend. They will take as long or as little as it takes to get her in a mindset where she trusts him, and then the process of moving forward usually ends up. Well, the other thing that I think is important to tell people is that if we as people and a society and families and friends don't define young women's worth and young people's worth, the traffickers will do it for us, and that's how they get them. Is they tell the girls that they're valuable, and they tell them that they're beautiful, and then so once they have them, the initiation will happen, and the initiation happens in lots of different ways. It could be that the woman or girl is sleeping in his house because she ran away from home, and she's been there for like 2 weeks, and then he says, you've been here, and I haven't really asked you for anything, like, maybe, want to give me a little something in exchange for like what we've done? And then he'll have sex with her, or he'll rape her, or they'll call many men in to gang rape her, or he will put her on the streets and say, come back with $600 or I'll kill you tomorrow, or he will pull out a picture of her little brother or sister and say, if you don't do what I'm telling you to do, I'm going to kill this person that you love. And that is not an exaggeration. People talk to us sometimes and they'll say we're using scare tactics. I was furious because I heard the other day that some people, one of the survivors that we work with, her name is Rowena, she's an alumni, she works at Breaking Free, and she went to talk to a group. And the leaders, the facilitators of the group, accused her of using scare tactics while telling her story. And that was not, it was another form of trauma. It was somebody telling her that what she had experienced wasn't real. But it is real, and we know that it's real because we see it over and over and over and over and over again. So after the initiation happens, then they're enslaved, and they're put into this kind of bubble where their world only works around their particular pimp or trafficker and the other women or girls that are in the stable. They're taught not to look at other people. They're taught that their transactions need to be quick and that they need to just happen. Some people will say that some John's offenders will be really, really proud of themselves and will be like, I'm against sex trafficking, but I've slept with 10,000 ladies. And it's like they think that they're getting out of it. But what I would say to those people is that a woman who's enslaved in a stable like that has been told 3 things. She's been told, if you leave, I will kill you and I will kill your family. She's been told, I am going to send people to you who are going to ask you if you're here because you want to be, and if you say no, I will know, and then I will kill you and your family. And they are told the police are not your friends, you will be arrested, and then I will kill you and your family. And so the likelihood that if a guy walked into a room and said, do you want to do this, that she would say no, is dramatically low. It's ridiculously low. And when we actually look at, I have no patience for the argument that some people want to do it. I understand that some people want to do it, but to those people, I honestly, at this point in my life, say, maybe think of a different career choice, okay? And I'm very serious about that, and I know it's not a popular opinion, but the actuality, the truth of the matter is that there's a hierarchy of coercion when it comes to these women. And I can send you the pyramid at some point later if I find it, if you're interested in it, but only 2% of the women who are engaged in prostitution are there of their own volition. They enter into it because they want to. They have a great experience. A trick never kidnaps and brutally beats them. A pimp never finds them and decides that he's her, that she's his. And she leaves and she thinks it was a great experience. But those voices are the loudest in our communities because those are the voices of middle-class white women who already have money, who are probably doing it to get an education. And those are the voices that we're hearing when they talk about that, and they have stronger and more powerful voices than our survivors do. And so like the prospect that there are places where it's supposed to be like some great thing is ridiculous to me. When people talk about legalization, I mean, the mayor of Amsterdam called it, or that area in Amsterdam called it an abysmal failure, and we know that it is. Because because places where it's legal become sites of incredible organized crime, and serious sex trafficking and human trafficking. And one of the things that kind of brought me to that place and an understanding of that was I read a book called Slavery, Inc. by Lydia Cacho, who's a journalist who traveled and interviewed a lot of people involved in this world. And one of the traffickers that she interviewed said, we like legalization of prostitution. We like it because it makes it easier for us. Because we can be managers instead of pimps. And that's, I mean, it's a reality. I said that a bunch of times, but I believe it. There's such a big difference between learning about it and thinking intellectually about this issue, and then walking into that space and being surrounded by women and girls who have been through that experience. And that's one of the reasons why Sisters of Survival is so important, because even the women and girls, you've got to think about the experiences that they've been through. And even they will come in and they'll say, I wasn't trafficked, what do you mean? My boyfriend and I would have parties sometimes, and like 6 guys would come over and we'd have sex and they'd leave some money, it'd be fine. And they didn't believe that was trafficking. They didn't believe that they were being prostituted by their boyfriends. They didn't believe that that was happening. And that, a lot of the women who come through are in these cycles, and they believe truly from the bottom of their hearts that they are there because they want to be. And then they start to think about the reality of what's happening to them and what has happened to them and the things that they've seen, and red flags start popping up, and they realize by the time they get to graduation, the vast majority of them realize by the time they get to graduation that what was happening to them was sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. So they get through their 12-week program. We do a graduation that's really exciting and really moving, and all of the women get to get up and speak, and they say thank you to the advocates and thank you to the facilitators and thank you for everything that you've done for us. And then they are incorporated into our alumni program, and they get to stay as long as they want. They come to support group meetings. They have access to permanent housing, which is one of the biggest barriers to people getting out of the life. It's not just about shelters, it's about actually giving them a place to live. A place where they can call their own, where they don't have to pay to be there every night, or they know that it's temporary. They need a permanent place to live, and so we have those spaces available for them too. And as long as a woman as long as a woman needs help, if she's coming to our alumni group, she can stay with us for as long as she needs to. Sorry, there were a lot of tangents in there.
No.
So you talked about you don't agree with legalization of prostitution, and I would assume you also don't think that the current legal, I don't know, just the way that the law stands with prostitution and around it isn't good either. What changes would you encourage?
So I believe firmly, as of right now, that the Nordic model is the best way to go. So the Nordic model was implemented in Sweden in 1999, I believe, and it's fantastic. It's a really really good system, because so sex trafficking is able to flourish. It's a business, is what it is. Essentially, it's a business, and you would recognize this triangle in an economics class, in a finances class, in a business class. You've got your supplier, which is the trafficker. You've got your supply, which is icky to think about, but you've got your supply, which is the women, and you've got your demand. And I'll just say about the supply, the thing that makes this business so lucrative, and the reason that it's overtaking drug trafficking right now, is that when you take a drug, and when you sell a drug and then it's used, it's gone. But you can use a woman until she's dead. Over and over and over, every single night, you can use her until she is dead. And there's no such thing as healthcare on the streets. There's no such thing. The women that we've seen come through our program, I don't think we have ever seen a woman who had a penny to her name because of what she was doing. But the traffickers make astounding amounts of money. And can I draw a diagram?
Absolutely. Just have to make that thing go up.
I don't know how to do that. Oh, I'm sorry. I've battled with that
I
thing
know,
enough times that I don't even want to
don't
try
like
it.
it.
So there's the supplier, there's the supply, and there's Thomas who does this. And so like I'm gonna explain to you the reason that it's hard to cut out so that's why it's hard to cut out the supply. Because there is an endless supply of women and girls who are being told every day that they are shit and that they don't matter. And nobody is telling those little girls that they belong to anybody and that they deserve to be alive. And so when a trafficker comes and is like, oh my God, you have beautiful eyes, she's like, wow, somebody finally cares about me and loves my eyes, right? And then she's sucked in. And we have, seriously, unlimited supply of little girls who are having that experience in our world right now. But besides that, again, like the supply, it doesn't give out, she stays until she's dead or until she finds something like breaking free. But then the reason that it's hard to cut off the supplier is this. So a stable looks like this. So this is the pimp, and if I'm using effective and correct terminology, we at Breaking Free, instead of saying pimp because we see the way that pimp has been glorified in culture and made like an okay thing, we say trafficker. And sometimes we talk about it as being interchangeable, and it is a little bit more complicated than that. Because pimp implies that there's like one guy and a couple of ladies, and she's, that maybe it's like it's a really simple system, whereas trafficking is a lot more complex and it's a much bigger operation, but we still consider them to be about the same thing. So underneath him is the bottom bitch, and that woman is putting the women on Backpage, and she's following them to their locations where they're performing sex. And she's collecting money, and she's handling the banks. And so we, think about, why is that a good position to be in, do you think?
Because inherently you have more power than the people immediately underneath you. But
So
at least
that's
you
why you
have
might
that
want-
small amount of power.
Yep, so that's one reason why you might want to be in that position. Anybody else?
You're not being raped.
Thank you. You're not being raped. You're not being consistently, repeatedly raped. And the women on the streets in Minneapolis are raped an average of 10 times a night. And we can call it other stuff, but it's paid rape. That's what it is. And any other reasons why you think that this system exists? Why do you think this is valuable for the supplier?
I mean, the girls are seen with a woman. I guess if like an old man would walk around with a 13-year-old girl, that'd be kind of suspicious.
So it's hard to track him down. It's hard to identify him as a trafficker.
The women can connect to her more because she's a woman versus the man.
That's probably true. That's very true.
Well, if something like happens, all the consequences fall on her instead of the trafficker.
That's the big one. If Ramsey County Attorney John Choi is looking to put somebody in prison, who does he have the evidence on? Whose IP address is hooked to the women on Backpage? Putting the clothes on the ladies and buying the clothes for them. It's her. And so she's the one who's going down. And that's another one of the, and it would be absurd to think that she was anything other than coerced into that position. Because if you had the choice between being her and being all of the women below her, what would you rather be? you know?
Wow.
And so it's absurd to think that she's there of her own volition, but that's one of the reasons that so many of our women and girls come into Breaking Free with trafficking charges. Because she's the one who it looks like, and I'm not saying that there are no female traffickers. There are female traffickers, there absolutely are. But there are a lot of situations in which the women who come through Breaking Free have trafficking charges because they were in that situation. And that is why it's so hard to cut off the supplier. Yeah.
Would you say it's easier for a bottom bitch to get out of the cycle of trafficking, or harder?
Then the stable.
Yeah, than the stable. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
you say people coming in with trafficking charges, so
Right.
it makes me think they're coming straight from that position.
They come in from, I mean, I actually think that it's easier for the women in the bottom of the stable to get out, because for them, I think, and I don't mean like 80%.
Yeah,
I mean
yeah.
like an amount that we recognize. It's not like 1 out of 500, right? I think it's easier for her to stay because she's not being raped every night. Is what I really think is probably why it's easier for them to stay, and that doesn't mean that she's never being sold. And that position is really shaky. You know, if she falls out of favor for any reason, another woman could get up to the top, and it becomes a really scary community. I mean, it is a scary community, but it becomes a different kind of scary because they're competing for this kind of position. You want to get into the trafficker's favor, and it's not like they don't have a relationship with the trafficker. He's their trafficker, he's their pimp, but she's the one who's doing all the paper trail stuff. He's probably the one who's delivering most of the beatings. He's probably the one who got her in and showed her a picture of her little brother. You know, he's probably the one who's making the majority of the threats, but he's just not doing the stuff that you can kind of keep track of. And so it's really, really, really hard to get a hold of the supplier for that reason. We've been better. We've been getting better, especially in St. Paul. John Choi is a pretty good partner for Breaking Free, and he talks a lot about how a couple of years ago we would maybe get 4 people for trafficking over the course of several years. In the past 5 years, we've gotten 72. They've been, so when law enforcement and public officials are really taking ownership of this issue, change happens, right? And people get caught doing it, and they're more likely to get caught when, okay, so think about it in this way when we talk about law enforcement, right? So if a girl is picked up by law enforcement and the law enforcement bring her into a room and is like, tell me everything, and also who's your trafficker, she's not gonna say anything to that person. She doesn't believe that person is there to help her. She doesn't want to experience that secondary trauma, and she might be in love with her trafficker and her pimp because that's how serious the psychological damage has been done to her. She might be in love with that person. Even survivors who have been out of life for 5 or 10 years could still be in love with their trafficker or pimp. It's serious psychological damage that's been done. But once we get, as we're developing law enforcement and relationships with law enforcement to a place where they understand more of the intricacies of the situation and they're able to say, that is not effective, but this is effective, giving her time, giving her space, giving her, telling her that she's valuable, not asking anything from her, not feeling like there's an exchange that has to happen for the information, but rather just giving her things not without expecting anything, and giving her time, the time that she needs to get to a place where she might be able to say, this guy was my trafficker or this guy was my pimp, and that does take a long time. So, all of this to explain, the Nordic model is currently the best system that we've seen. It's been implemented in Sweden, Iceland, and another place I can't remember. We use it to an extent in St. Paul, kind of unofficially. If a woman or girl is picked up by the police right now, they take her to Breaking Free. They say, here are your resources, how can we help you? And then they help Breaking Free help her. It was really cool. At a graduation the other day, we had one of the ladies got up and she thanked an officer who had brought her into the program 6 months ago and had been consistently calling her every once in a while to make sure that she was okay and to lend her like support and to tell her that, you know, that he was rooting for her, and he was there at her graduation. And it's those kinds of relationships are really valuable and really important for them to develop. But so in that system, they punish the demand and they punish the supplier, but they don't punish the ladies. They consider the ladies to be victims. They go into the situation with that mindset, not to victimize them and not to what?
Criminalize.
Exactly. That's the whole point of it, is they're not criminalizing the women. But their response to the women is to give them resources for how they can get out of the life and tell them that they can do other things. They don't have to sell their bodies for money. And then they criminalize the demand. They'll send the men to John schools, which are diversion programs to help teach them what is going on and in this world that they don't understand. And they will go after the traffickers. Yeah.
I have one question.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of what you've explained is really working against the supply and with the supply, so to say, with the women. But, I mean, this all exists because of the demand, and it all exists because the demand increases. And, I don't know, like, what is your take on that? Like, how can we handle that? Because as long as there's people who are okay with paid rape is gonna exist. No matter how much we criminalize it, no matter how hard they go after the traffickers, it's gonna be there.
Well, that's why the Nordic model criminalizes the paid rape. Because when the guys in the area get the idea that it's not gonna happen and that it's dangerous and that they shouldn't do it and they should take their business elsewhere or use the porn or find a girlfriend, the demand cuts out. I'm serious, the demand cuts out. And when the demand isn't there and it ceases to be profitable, the supplier doesn't wanna do it anymore. If he can't find a demand, he's not gonna do something that's not profitable, because this entire system is based on profit. It's based on violence against women. It's based on the idea that that some people are less people than other people. It's based on those ideas, absolutely, and it's based on that oppression. But it's a financial system. It's financial gain that they're looking for. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? But when you cut out the cash flow, that's when it gets really effective. The way that we do that in St. Paul is we have something called the John School, and the John School happens once a month. The officers, when they catch a guy on his first offense, will give him like two options. Option one is to go to jail, and option two is to pay a $750 fee to attend Breaking Free's John School. And sometimes they'll say, if you sign up for the John School within 48 hours, we won't call your house. You know? So that tends to be pretty effective, and especially on the kind of National John Sting Day that happens every year. I don't remember which day of the year it is, but they do that. They'll say to the guys, 48 hours, or we're going to call your house, and that's super effective. But the guys will. The thing that you have to understand is that a lot of people just don't know, and a lot of people think the ladies are there because they want to be. But like I said, it's like 2% of the ladies are there because they want to be. The other ones are not. And usually the ladies in those systems are working within like their social systems and their crowds too. That's another thing that protects them. But so like the guys will go through this class and the process, and they hear about how dangerous it is for them. They hear about STDs because it's always effective to tell people that they're in danger. And so we put a lot of emphasis on that. But then we bring survivors to come in and talk about their experience. And we see consistently that the recidivism rate for these guys is really low. We catch them less. We can't prove that it's because they're not going out there, but we see from the beginning to the end of the class, we see guys come in and they're like, I'm grumpy, I'm mad, I'm a bad whatever, this is the dumbest thing ever. And then we say, we're not gonna yell at you for 8 hours, we just need you to know this information because it's important. And then they don't offend again. And sometimes they send us $5,000 checks, and sometimes they come to the Man Change Project, and sometimes they become completely different men. Because the reality of the situation is that a lot of people are just under or uninformed about it. And once we are able to inform them, it cuts the demand a little bit. And when we start to have conversations about what fuels the demand, and we have conversations about things like pornography and stripping and how they connect to sex trafficking, and it's very complicated. And once we start to talk about like male socialization and about how men are introduced to sex and about all of that, when we have those kinds of conversations and are able to continue to make culture changes in addition to policy changes, that's how we really start to have some progress happening in the fight against the demand, which is in turn the fight against sex trafficking. I'm sorry, you had your.
Where do you see education comes in there? As like, because, I'm studying secondary education,
Mhm.
and one thing that I've always wondered is, I mean, if, you know, if we encourage people to watch porn, then they're gonna become like desensitized at one point or another. Very often, I'm not saying like in general, because, I mean, it's a fact, like most porn looks like people who like it, but
Well,
a lot, you know,
the
and
connection to pornography is really complicated, and I'll just mention that really quickly. There's a guy named Chuck Derry who does a wonderful presentation on male socialization and violence, and if you ever get the chance to see him do that presentation, you should take it. He's going to be coming to talk at the Demand Change Project, and Gail Dines, Gail Dines, I think, has a TED Talk that you should look up if you're interested in that connection too, and she talks about pornography. And what we're seeing consistently with pornography is that it socializes men to get off to violence. Because of two big things that happen. First, there's more violence in porn now than there has ever been before, and when it happens, it's not like corrected, and it's not seen as being a negative thing. It's seen as it leads to pleasure, or it just is, or it's ignored, you know. And then, so like that's one big reason. And the other big reason is that porn sites are actually like marketing and branding violence and I mean more violent stuff. So like if somebody, not necessarily a man, but a person, goes on to a pornography site, especially young guys, because they're doing this, and they don't have any sort of other voice that's taught them about sex in their lives, or maybe the voice has been incomplete, or maybe the voice has been like, I feel a little bit uncomfortable talking to you about sex, and then they have to figure it out themselves with pornography. And so what happens on those sites that Chuck talks about in this presentation is that they'll be on the site, and at the very beginning, a window will come up, and it'll be advertising, for instance, revenge porn. And they click off of it right away, and they get back to doing their thing. And then a minute later, however long later, another window will come up, and it takes them 1 second longer to turn it off than it took them before. But they'll turn it off, and then they keep doing their thing. And then another window will come up, and it'll take them 5 or 6 seconds longer to turn it off. Until by the time they get to the end, and by the time they're reaching orgasm or whatever, maybe a window comes up and it takes them, they don't turn it off. Maybe a window comes up and they keep it on for 30 more seconds, but they're being socialized to accept revenge porn or other kinds of negative porn, not necessarily what they looked for, but the stuff that's coming up. They learn to associate that with pleasure, and they're learning to associate the violence that they're seeing in the pornography with pleasure. And we've seen when we do research on pornography that it leads to that it's frankly a public health issue. It leads to erectile dysfunction. That's a fact. It leads to dysfunctional sexual relationships between people because the stuff you're seeing is not the way that actual sex works, you know. And this is based on, I'm not an expert on pornography. I'm not an expert on the connection. If you're interested in this subject, this is actually the theme of day 2 of the Demand Change Project, or you should look up Gail Dines or Cordelia Anderson. They're really excellent speakers who draw the connections in better and more complete ways and have done like the research and know the details. And again, Chuck Derry's presentation, if you ever have that I saw the presentation at John School a couple of weeks ago. It was amazing.
Is that D-E-R-R-Y?
D-E-R-R-Y. He's great. He was the co-founder of the Minnesota Men's Action Network and the global the Gender Violence Institute. Thomas? Sorry.
They'll come back.
Maybe this is the 7-minute break moment. How about
Sorry.
that?
Sounds good.
So I'm not super intimately involved with the women's program as of right now. Like I said, I'm just kind of working in a finance piece that I'm excited to bring into SOS. We have a program called Life Skills, Job Skills that we do that is on Wednesday mornings and afternoons. People are invited to come in and teach a life skill or a job skill. And it can really be anything. We get a lot of people who, I mean, it could be, we had people at our last volunteer orientation saying that they wanted to teach the ladies how to make cakes and decorate cakes. We have people who come in and want to teach how to do hair. We have people who come in to do yoga with the women because we consider life skills to be things like psychological, mental, emotional wellness. And I know that in the past, I know that we had somebody who came in to volunteer with Breaking Free who did like the wall theater with them, to work with them. I don't know her personally. I found her because when I was first looking into Breaking Free and trying to break in, I was reaching out to some people with whom I had connections on LinkedIn to see what they could tell me about the organization and ways to get in. And one of the people that I found had done social justice theater with the ladies. But they're very open to that kind of thing, and I think it would be a really cool way to work with them. I just don't think it's something that we've done yet. And one thing that would be interesting to think about even in the future for a class or something like that, or a project in a class, is that the hope is that you or a group will commit to doing it like once every year or once every quarter or once every half year or something like that, so they have some consistency, so that the ladies who are going through the program this year won't get a completely different program than the ladies going through next year. And so that ends up being separate from their regular group situation, but it is a program where there's a lot of room for stuff like that.
That's cool.
Yeah, that's cool.
You remember what your question was, Thomas?
Yes, I do. Do you guys have partner organizations in other cities and states to like create a nationwide network of organizations like Breaking Free?
That's complicated. We don't have like a sister organization anywhere. We work with a lot of organizations. So the founder and executive director of Breaking Free, her name is Benita Carter. She's a very powerful woman. She's a really, really amazing, powerful woman. She's so cool. The first time that I ever went into Breaking Free to volunteer for the Capitol campaign, I sat in the seat like right next to her, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is Benita Carter. She's so cool. She was like a CNN hero. She's just an amazing woman. And now I have meetings with her, and we talk like friends. It's really nice. But she has she's made a lot of connections with other organizations that do the work as like a person. And so we're friends with a lot of organizations, or the director is friends with other directors, but we don't necessarily like share a program that we do kind of across the board or anything like that. We're inviting a bunch of them to the Demand Change Project, and we do whatever we can to bring in as many survivor speakers as possible. So like this year we'll have speakers from Thailand and the UK and Denmark and Ireland, and like Rachel Moran, who's on that list, she's a survivor. And that's our main focus. We don't really connect with organizations that don't have survivor leadership, because we really believe that survivor leadership is at the center of what we do. And it's just really hard to have an effective program when you don't have survivors at the forefront of everything that you're doing. Because, I mean, think about it. I kind of think of it when I think about our outreach program. Like, I could go do outreach. But as much as I can talk about this world to you, I don't understand it intimately. I've never been through it. If I walk up to a woman on the street and I say, hey, do you want this kind of service? They'll be like, get out of my face. You don't know who I am. You don't know anything about me. And how am I supposed to know that stuff, And it's possible. Like I can build relationships and friendships with our clients and with our ladies, and I love doing that. I love building those relationships. And some advocates are not survivors, but when it comes to the woman who is standing at the front of the SOS group, when a woman stands in front of that group and she says, what has happened to you was more than likely a situation of sex trafficking or sexual exploitation, like, are they more likely to take that from somebody who doesn't know them or their situation and has never been through it and has never seen it and only knows about it intellectually, or somebody who can say, that was my experience. This is how it happened to me. That's really similar to what I experienced. Let's expand on that, because I experienced this differently. And also, we've got women who can say, I call bullshit. You're not telling me the truth right now. Because they've been through it and they understand it. And they understand the world. And so and the other thing is that we just don't have as much survivor leadership as we should have. You know, that's why we invite so many survivors to the Demand Change Project, because it's so, so important that the women at the forefront of these organizations are survivors, making the decisions, developing the programs, that kind of stuff. So, I guess, if that answers your question.
Yeah, then I had another question too. So the Super Bowl is coming to Minneapolis in 2018. Is Breaking Free starting the planning stages for an event around that? Because I know that the Super Bowl is a huge event for human trafficking.
We'll do something, but so Polaris last year, the Polaris Project is one of the biggest and most important organizations that works on human trafficking because it collects our resources and it connects people to it. They have a National Human Trafficking Resource Center that does a lot of really great work. So if you see a situation that you think is human trafficking or sex trafficking, you can call them and say, this is what I saw, can you check it out? And they might have a conversation with you to get some more information, and they'll be the ones who send the people to check it out. So Polaris Project is a wonderful organization full of great resources, general resources for people. Polaris came out last year with sort of I wouldn't necessarily call it a campaign, but they started talking to people about the fact that, like, yeah, it's the Super Bowl, but also it's happening every day. And when it really comes down to it, the women, whether they're at the Super Bowl or on their own streets, are gonna be abused in that way. And it's frustrating to think about focusing our efforts on the Super Bowl, in part because it's like, okay, so you get all these resources together, you find all of these ladies, you get 500 ladies off the street that night, where are you gonna put them? Because we've got like 182 beds in the United States that are set aside for women who have been victims of prostitution, and like 54 of them are at Breaking Free. So what is gonna happen to those women once that has happened? And we just had a conversation about how there's a never-ending supply of ladies, right? So how are you going to deal with the massive influx of jobs that you have at that time? We don't have the resources to do that, we don't, and it just, like, it's frustrating because people want to address the Super Bowl, and the Super Bowl is important. Like, I'm not saying that it's not like a massive, horrible thing that happens, right? 10,000 ladies will be flown into Minneapolis in 2018 to be sold to the guys and the people who are mostly guys who are coming to Minneapolis for the Super Bowl. Like, that's horrible. That's horrible. But isn't it horrible enough that it's happening in the first place? I think that that's kind of where the frustration comes. And so we'll do something. Like, we saw a community do a really great project this year where they made a resource packet for the women who were coming in. I have no idea how they distributed it, because I'm like, what did you do? Did you just, like, take these freaking packets on the street and, like, look for ladies? It doesn't work. Also, most ladies are sold on Backpage these days. Technology has completely revolutionized the industry of human trafficking. Because it makes it easier to buy and sell ladies and do it online in ways that are a little bit more difficult to detect. And so it's not happening like on street corners as much as it is happening on Backpage and other places like that. And so I kind of forgot where I was going with that after the Super Bowl. But it's important, and I don't want to downplay the importance of it. And so they put together a resource that said, here's a place where you can go to rest that's open 24 hours. Here's a laundromat where you can go that's open 24 hours. Here's a place where you can get food. And also, here's some organizations in this area where you can get help if you want it. And here's some organizations in your home state where you can get help if you want it. And Breaking Free was on that list. If there were Minnesota girls, because there were, flown to Phoenix for the Super Bowl last year, if they would have gotten that resource, they would have gotten Breaking Free's phone number out of it. But like I said, I think it's frustrating for us because it's like, yes, the Super Bowl is going to happen, and it's a great opportunity to leverage that event to get a response from the community, because the community really, really cares about it, especially in Minneapolis. And it's cool to think of ambitious things like maybe by 2018, we can try to be a free Twin Cities where we don't accept that kind of stuff here. But it's still like I said, I have no doubt that it's happening in St. Peter right now. So let's focus some of our efforts on expanding the services that are available to the women in Minnesota and creating more spaces and addressing the culture that is allowing for it to happen, and try to piggyback off of that to do better work at the Super Bowl that's going to have lasting changes. But there are conversations that are happening, and Breaking Free will do something. I would just challenge you and others when you think about the Super Bowl to try to make sure to address that fact that it's happening every day.
I have a question. I think it was a study about Polaris, and I saw this when actually I was helping Sammy figure out a project. I first suggested hey, Super Bowl, where Twin Cities are having in 2018, sex trafficking, and I think there's a study about Polaris that said that's actually largely like a myth, that people are flown in droves to the cities. So I just to clear up misinfo, because I still don't know if that was
Right. Well, there will be lots of people brought in.
right.
But it's definitely a myth that it's like hundreds of thousands of people are gonna come to Minnesota. Like, frankly, there are a lot of ladies in Minnesota who are being exploited already.
Yeah.
Frankly, I would also think that would be a big no-no territorially for the traffickers, because that's also a really complex world. You know, women can't look at another lady's pimp or trafficker, because she will get the shit beat out of her if she looks at another pimp or trafficker that's not her own, right? And so I imagine that that's another place that would prevent the kind of exaggeration and the misinformation that's spread about that, is that like, I can't imagine that traffickers would be like, yeah, sure. And actually, they deal with that a little bit in the book Trafficked, because Sophie Hayes was trafficked into France for a period of time from Italy, and she was aggressively attacked by people, verbally and physically, by the people who like owned the street, and for whom that street was like their space. And again, I guess it would be a kind of a different thing with the back page pieces, but it's definitely not something that we want to put a lot of emphasis on. Yeah, and that's a great piece to bring up, and I think that's true, that there is a lot of misinformation about bringing people in.
Yeah, I like to move a little bit away from the specifics of your work and ask you a question. So when Coco was speaking, because I see some parallels between you, what you do and what she does in regards to like how you do and how you got there. And she was speaking about working with the Black Lives Matter movement and with a lot of immigrant families and stuff like that. And that for doing her work, it's very important to be aware of the space she takes up, and to be very aware of like, should I speak right now or should I not speak right now, because I am for the cause, but it is not my story. And I see some parallels with you just working in that environment. Like, how do you deal with that, being very much an advocate and speaking very passionately, but still like having that space available for the people who are survivors?
Right. I shut up a lot, you know? Like, in this environment, I'm comfortable speaking about it and talking to you about it. If there were a survivor in the room with me, she would be the one with the floor. That's just the way that it works for me. And a lot of people get really squirmy when they think about that, because it's like, I'm an advocate. I want to be involved. I want to do, I want to talk about it. It's not, I have the right to talk about it too. I got a lot of information. I read a lot of books. I should have the right to be involved in this conversation. And for me, I guess the answer has been to just like try to be really conscious of that position in my situation, We have a speakers bureau that sends out speakers to a bunch of different places, and I'm excited that I've been added to the speakers bureau and will be able to be more involved in that after the Make Change project. But if they have the option between sending Joy Friedman and sending me, or sending Terry Forletti or Rowena Matthews or sending me, they're going to send them, and they should send them, because it is their story. And so that's something that I try really hard to maintain, and that I maintain in the office as well. The other thing is I will, I try to important that she talks, but it's more, everything about it is better than anything I can say to you, you know, in my, you know, and that's something that I think is something that I try to approach with as much like grace and humility as I can. And for me, it's not a source of any sort of like anger or anxiety or anything. Like I said, I think some people get really kind of upset with that idea that they're not gonna like have as much time or as much of a voice. Like it happened at the Building Bridges conference, actually. We were talking about survivor-led agencies, and Jessica Valenti kept saying like, this is, you know, survivors need to be involved in the conversation about how, you know, how we should respond to sexual assault and what are the appropriate measures that should be taken. And I had a conversation with a friend who was saying, you know, I'm really bothered by that idea that I have to, that like my voice becomes not as important as theirs. And it's like, I mean, because we're in this room, we're in like positions of privilege, right? And there's so many things that are so complicated to it. So, I guess if I were to go back to like the origin of the question, I would say I try to take up as little space as I can in that kind of environment. I will always give the floor to the survivor who's speaking, especially when it's about the story or about the issue, because I just know that she knows better than I do. That doesn't mean that I necessarily think that I don't have a voice or that there aren't appropriate times for me to enter into the conversation. Like one of the things that I find it to be valuable to talk about is my transition from being, like if you had asked me 2 years ago if I thought that prostitution should be legal and if I thought it was okay, I would have been like, yeah, totally, whatever, if you want to do it, then like it's your choice. As long as it's your choice, that's fine. Now I understand a little bit more about like what the system looks like, and I understand it a little bit more intricately to a point where I'm more comfortable saying, think about a different career, and I'm more comfortable saying, talking about like the systems of oppression surrounding it, and talking about things like how I came to kind of understand that like people's actions don't exist in a vacuum, and I see that every day when I'm at Breaking Free. That like one person speaking out and being like, prostitution is okay, tells a bunch of guys that it's okay to buy ladies and not care about what's happening to them or where they're coming from, you know? So like that's a conversation that I feel really good having. And I feel really good talking to like colleges and academic situations and saying, this is how you can make your words and your experience more valuable and more impactful. And the other thing that I do, and I kind of learned this from Sergeant Grant Snyder from the Minneapolis Police, who is an amazing person and a wonderful speaker and somebody that I admire a great deal. Before he does any of his speaking engagements, he will say, I have to start this off by saying that I'm only here because of the grace and the understanding that survivors have had in being willing to tell me their stories. And then he'll go into his unique viewpoint. But I definitely do try to give the floor to survivors in any situation, especially when it relates to the women's program and stuff like that.
Is there, it's interesting to me that you say that you use ladies when you do, and I wonder if, does that come from that organization and their effort too? Because I know that in middle class or academic settings, there's like, call me a woman, but lady, for a lot of people, is a more respectful term.
We refer to the women that we work with as the ladies. It's terminology that we use within the organization, definitely. That's something that has been really interesting, is getting used to the terminology and to the environment. I'm just, I don't know, learning a lot about like how it's appropriate to talk to people and what it, I mean, the thing that I learned pretty quick, I think, at Breaking Free was that there is a pretty big difference between the classroom and the conversations that we have here and then actually stepping into the field. And your language changes and the way that you talk to people changes, and the things that are of value in some ways change, you know. And so it is, and so like I do talk about the ladies, because that's how the ladies talk about themselves and about each other, and that's how the advocates talk about each other too. And I do think that it's a term of respect and just a way to acknowledge they're not little girls, you know, I think that, if somebody wants to, be called a woman, then she will be called a woman, absolutely. And I think just, it's easier to talk about them in the kind of broader
Well,
terms.
there's more distinction between a lady and a slave than there is between a woman and a slave, right?
I think so.
I mean, and it's from the perspective of people who've been called ladies and now want to have more, self-determination about
Mhm.
being strong.
Mhm.
But if you're talking about people coming up from the bottom, they didn't get to be called ladies to reject that,
Yeah.
haven't had that,
Yeah.
that opportunity,
Mhm.
to be in that respected, position,
Mhm.
so,
Mhm.
it was interesting.
That's cool.
Yeah.
At the beginning, you were talking about how, like, the stage from awareness to consciousness,
Mhm.
and I first thought that was kind of like awareness is sympathy and consciousness is empathy. But then, where would, like, being, like, personal experience fall into that? Like, because you're conscious of this, but you haven't personally, like, gone through it.
Mhm.
So, like, can someone, like a survivor, not be conscious of it and only be aware of it?
I don't think so. I think it's a completely different way of living. And I say that in large part because a lot of the people that I work with are survivors, and they will talk about their stories, and a lot of them are really open about their stories. Some are not open about their stories. There are a lot of things, it's a traumatic event, and people deal with it in different ways. But to give an example, when we did John School a couple of weeks ago, and I had the privilege of sitting in on that. And at one point, a woman named Bosni got up to speak. She's a survivor, and she's an incredible woman, and the things that she has survived are unbelievable. They're unspeakable. But she talks really frankly about how, like, okay, so the guys at the beginning of John School talk about how, like, the guys who go into those situations are in danger. Johns are in danger, and they put a lot of emphasis on that, which always, like, pisses off the women in the room who are working in direct services, because we're like, it's not about you, but it is about them. Like, it has to be about them, or nothing will change, right? And there is a lot of, and there is value to telling them about the danger that they're in. We know that they're not in as much danger as the ladies, but that doesn't mean it's not important to tell them about that danger. But so Bosni was telling them she was the dangerous one. She was saying, I'm the one who's got a loaded gun, and I will kill you, and I will take everything you have, because it's easier for me to do that than to have sex with you. And she would talk about that, and she does it in a really effective way, but, like, that's just her part of the presentation. But then she was talking about how, like, the guys just had to pay $750, and it was wiped off of their records. And Rowena pitched in from the back, and she said, if I could wipe out the things that I have been through for $750, I would do it in a heartbeat. But I will never forget the things that have happened to me. And I think about them every single night. And it's true. And because those women never get a day off. They don't get to sleep. Like, they don't get, they don't get breaks. They don't get a holiday. Every night they're on the streets being repeatedly raped. And then they might rest literally by a river for a couple of hours. They might curl up on the dirt by the Minnesota River to take a rest, because there's nowhere else that's safe for them. And they might lay there and get barely enough sleep, because they know that they need to get back on the streets to be continuously making money. Like, the things that are happening to them are too like horrific. Those things don't leave you. They don't leave them. And that's not to say that there can't be recovery, because there can be. And the places that they were compared to the places where they are now are a testament to that process of recovery. But I think that if there are women who do not have that trauma that they're experiencing and working through, I think it's usually because there's more that's happening that's probably unhealthy, and that's not across the board. There are people who feel comfortable inhabiting that space, and there are people who feel comfortable distancing themselves from the trauma, and a lot of people who have had to because of the nature of what's happened. If you can live without reliving that stuff, that's what you want to do, right? But it's a lot more complicated, I think, and I think that exists completely outside of the world of awareness versus consciousness. Yeah.
And I know a lot of things have been directed back to Coco, but as she said earlier, there are a lot of parallels.
That's okay.
What I wanted to ask was, one thing that Coco brought up that I thought was extremely interesting was she brought up the notion between there being a difference between a safe space and a brave space, and how that, like, although the safe space is necessary for the survivor or the victim, I think she said that the brave space was also about the people who were there to listen to those people. And so, like, how do you, in your day-to-day working with these victims and survivors, how do you yourself get through? Because it's got to be like emotionally taxing. Like, it's me sitting here listening to it, in detail for the first time is hard. So, like, how do you deal with that on a day-to-day basis?
Well, my experience is a little bit different than most of the women that I work with because, as I said, I'm not doing direct services. When I do work with survivors, as you mentioned, one thing that's been happening a lot more lately is that, so we have an intern at Breaking Free. She was in the life for 32 years. She has been with Breaking Free for 3 years now. The way she got out of Breaking Free is that she was kidnapped by a trick, beat brutally with a hammer, came out in the head, came out with no bottom teeth and most of her top teeth missing, and metal plates in her head, and was in a coma for 6 months. And these are things that she will tell you in your day-to-day. You will be sitting at your desk, and she will sit down, and she will pull a picture of her family from the desk next to her, and she will say, "That's my sibling. That sibling has a mental illness. That's my sibling. I don't really talk to that sibling. That's my sibling. He tried to rape me when I was 12. And I've told him that I forgive him, but I'm not gonna be able to forget it. And that's my other sibling." And that's a reality for her, and something she brings to the space, and something that is very, very difficult to hear. I think that in some ways I have developed some barriers between myself and the information, because I just can't cry at work every day. Like, I can't go to work every day and burst into tears because what we're dealing with is horrible. I've only at work ever had an outburst once by a piece of information that I had received. And I was reading an article from the University of Minnesota's Urban Development Center, and they were talking about the victims that they had surveyed in the article, and they were talking about the ages of the victims, and the youngest victim in the article was 4 years old for that exploitation. And that, I can't deal with that without it really, like, it hurts to think about that information. And it hurts to hear those stories from Judy, because she is one of the most, like, beautiful people that you will ever meet in your life. One of the most loving and beautiful people. Like, she walks into a space and she just loves you and gives you a hug, and, like, you mean the world to her. We celebrated her 50th birthday the other day, and it's amazing that she's alive, right? But I think for me, usually, I end up having to put up a lot of just barriers between myself and the work that I'm doing. And it's really important to practice self-care in these environments. It's extremely important for me to go home and leave my work at home. I used to go home and maybe I would keep, like, studying and researching, and maybe I would watch a new film or read a new book or something. I can't do that anymore. Now I just play with my cat and have a cup of tea, because I think having that space between myself and the work that I'm doing is very important. But I think it's, and I don't know if you would call it like professionalism, or I really like what Coco said about creating a brave space. That I think is really cool. And I don't know how the advocates do it. And I know that there's one advocate she's not an advocate, she's a regional director that I work, or regional navigator that I work with, who connects youth to resources. And sometimes she does have to break down, in part because she works with little girls most of the time. She'll get a call from a 12-year-old who's trying to get out of a situation. And she again is really good at being in the space, and you do the space, and then you leave the space and you do what you have to do to kind of recuperate, and just like try to remind yourself that this evil exists in the world, and you're seeing it and you're interacting with it, but there's also like this incredible love, and the work you're doing is putting hope into the world and putting hope into the hearts of those ladies, and so you do what you have to do, and I think it's different for everybody.
Well, thank you so much, Julia.
You were